My name is Claire Barnes, and as Mike has noted, I'm a master's student in the Divinity School studying the intersection of religion and ecology. I'm particularly interested in food and religious or ritualistic experience, and through working in communications at the Beinecke, I've developed an interest in food-related archival pieces. Today, I will present an adaptation of a blog post I wrote this summer for the Beinecke, which was titled An Early Climate Advocate, Note Cards in the Rachel Carson Papers. As many of you know, Rachel Carson was a biologist and environmentalist who ignited the modern environmental movement, educating the American public on the dangers of pesticides on bird life and human life through the publication of Silent Spring in 1962. This piece first appeared in a serial form in the New Yorker. Here in this slide, we see a translated cover of Silent Spring, translated in Icelandic, and a photograph of Rachel Carson from May, 1963. Maria Popova of the blog, the known blog, Brain Pickings, writes of Carson's legacy. Rachel Carson, a Copernicus of biology, who ejected the human animal from its hubristic place at the center of Earth's ecological cosmos, and recast it as one of myrid organisms, all worthy of wonder, all imbued with life and reality. Her lyrical writing rendered her not a mere translator of the natural world, but an alchemist transmuting the steel of science into the gold of wonder. Carson was born in 1907 in Pennsylvania and graduated from Pennsylvania College for Women in 1929. She went on to study zoology at Johns Hopkins. Prior to pursuing a full career as a nature writer, she worked at the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a scientist, writer, and editor. The Beinecke holds Rachel Carson's archives with material ranging from 1921 to 1989. Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us, published in 1951, remained on the bestseller list for 86 weeks. The Sea Around Us has been described as a romantic biography of the ocean, in which Carson blends scientific data with imagistic, majestic, and awe-inspiring portrayals of the ocean. As Popova noted, Carson is an alchemist transmuting the steel of science into the gold of wonder. End quote. Originally assigned as a general article during her employment at the Bureau of Fisheries in Washington, The Sea Around Us, in addition to later published books Under the Sea Wind and Edge of the Sea, established Rachel Carson as a household name and a celebrated nature writer. Here are clippings from Carson's archives, which document the publication and popularity of The Sea Around Us. In an essay called Origins of the Book, The Sea Around Us, Carson writes, "People often ask me how long I worked on The Sea Around Us. I usually reply that in a sense I've been working on it all my life, although the writing of the book occupied only about 3 years. As a very small child, I was fascinated by the ocean, although I had never seen it. I dreamed of it and longed to see it, and I read all the sea literature I could find." To organize her citations and notes for The Sea Around Us, Carson used an extensive note card system. Her note cards are organized topically, ranging from navigation to petroleum to oceanography. Through diving into these cards, we can see her thought process, style of organizing scientific scholarship, and her driving questions and epiphanies. Unfortunately, it seems like the card on the right here is not showing up, so I'm gonna exit the screen and see if maybe if I share the screen again, if it'll work. Okay, seems to not be showing up. But I'll describe what's in the card if you can't see it. And it was actually the card that was sent out as the cover photo for the event. Importantly, Carson's note cards document ever pertinent issues like climate change, sea level rise, coral reef, and microorganism health. Between typed and handwritten notes, which I'll show in a second, Carson's research on early climate change scholarship influenced the development of a larger environmental ethic present in her later work. Here, she's taking notes on Arctic climate change and climatic changes in Iceland. Her citations connect rising temperatures to the health of fish fauna. And in the right card, which you can't see, she connects a decrease in herring to the disappearance of industry at Plymouth. She recognizes that much of the ocean is under-researched, yet Carson's citations underscore the persistent reality of climate change. That scientists have reported environmental changes much earlier than the introduction of both non-anthropogenic and human-caused climate changes as a political topic at the 1973 United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. Often criticized as the sole instigator of America's climate movement, we can see that Carson's work, which was highly influential, was building on scholarship prior to 1950, which discusses the retreat of great glaciers and oceanic temperature changes. Let's see. Carson is keen to notice imagistic language in other texts, no doubt influencing her own fusion of narrative and science. Interestingly, she animates the ocean itself, positioning waves as alive and the land-sea relation as ever evolving. On one of her note cards, she writes with abbreviated language, "Theme of chapter is wave as a living thing, through which ocean makes its power felt. Each wave has a definitive cycle from birth to death." In addition to detailed citations, as part of research for the sea around us, Carson boarded fishing boats and research vessels. She was the first woman ever to take part in a cruise on the Albatross III. Carson writes about her firsthand experience with the vast expanse of the ocean. To write with an understanding about the ocean, one needs to pay a firsthand visit to the undersea world. And with this in mind, I learned what the surface of the water looks like from underneath, and how exquisitely delicate and varied are the colors displayed by the animals of the reef. And I got the feeling of the misty green vistas of a strange, non-human world. Carson discusses a variety of marine life in her note cards, painting a picture of the ocean teeming with life, from the biggest mammal of the ocean, whales, to smaller organisms like plankton and snails. She prioritizes every aspect of her subject, detailing each part of the ocean with equal care. In Carson's archives, we have illustrations by Bob Hines, known nature artist whose Stamps of Ducks in 1946 sold over 2 million copies. These illustrations shown here were completed for Carson's publication after The Sea Around Us, The Edge of the Sea. Carson met Bob Hines while working for the federal government, and Hines often visited Carson and completed his illustrations for her during his service assignments. Carson often left the drawing up to Bob Hines, but sometimes she sketched in her note cards to remind her of the depths of the ocean, and in the case of this note card, the specific qualities of the Mediterranean. Carson's note cards span a variety of geographic locations, in addition to a survey of scientific information about our oceans. In the process of writing The Sea Around Us, Carson consulted more than 1,000 print sources, and much of her research resulted from data obtained from submarine warfare during World War II. She writes, "I believe I consulted, at a minimum, somewhat more than 1,000 separate printed sources. Librarians of special collections, both government and private, searched out for me many obscure documents, and dealers in old and rare books located certain old oceanographic volumes that I needed for my working library." Carson also discusses the anthropogenic causes of climate change, predating many scientific discussions of human intervention. First, she questions humanity's nautical exploration in historical narratives, noting, as we can see on this card, America not discovered by Columbus. In other note cards, Carson contemplates the impact of European colonization on indigenous fauna and peoples. As part of her exploration of the wonder of the ocean, She reminds us of humanity's power, both negative and positive, to affect the environment. Rachel Carson's note cards are a testament to her devotion to scientific and historical knowledge, as well as a reminder of the wonders of the ocean. Her work is indicative of her robust research processes and her homage to many scientific studies that predate her own publications. Working through her archives in a slower archival time has inspired me to look back at history to develop a forward-looking, ever-evolving, interdisciplinary and intersectional environmental movement. Especially in light of new developments in deep sea mining and the urgency of climate action, Carson's legacy can inspire us to research deeply, but act now. She balances cultivating wonder with a strong environmental ethic concerned with anthropogenic impacts on the environment and climate change as an early climate advocate. Thank you everyone so much. This is my last slide.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that introduction to some of Rachel Carson's research process. I think we'll have people looking to re-engage with Carson if they know her, and others to read her for the first time. You noted that you're involved in an interdisciplinary and intersectional process in encountering these archives and in your work. And I'd also say it's intergenerational, both with Rachel Carson. And I wanted to give a shout out also to the person you and I talked about these cards, and they came on my radar screen thanks to Frances Beinecke, one of the great supporters of this library and of Yale, great alum of Yale and former director of the Natural Resources Defense Council, who pointed out these cards, and they were just like a revelation to me, and it's a delight to share them with you. But I wanted to give a shout out to Frances for bringing them to our attention here at the library. And it shows that readers are oftentimes some of the best discoverers of things for those of us who work in a library. I wanted to pursue sort of your final thoughts and ask you to sort of talk a little bit about more what you do with these things. So you talked about how this is, as it were, fuel in a good sense for your own thinking and work. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about how that encounter with the past and the present informs your work for the future.
Yeah, I think I was having a conversation with one of my friends who's also working on the Rachel Carson Papers. And we were talking about archival process and delving into Carson's papers as a way to not to slow down our thinking in a deliberate and intentional way to grapple with our understanding of climate history and climate science, and to think about the long researched topic of climate change, and thinking about climate change in specifically at thinking after COP26 of anthropogenic emissions, and thinking about how what does the slowness of archival time, the slowness of archival research speak to the urgency of climate action now. And I think that they have really interesting intersections, and that's, I think, why my work with these note cards have been some interdisciplinary, because I'm coming from a religious background, but also with an awareness of environmental issues. And I think that Carson's work, thinking about her popularity, that we should give voice to young climate activists, that we should give voice to Indigenous peoples, to women, to people who have been traditionally excluded from climate action. And I think about the Indigenous and local peoples platform that was developed at COP23, and thinking about the work that we still have left to do for climate action, but with the knowledge that we have these archives that can tell us that scientists and scholars and writers have been working on this for a long time. So it's not something new. And I think to me, that is really the richness that her archives can give to us.
Really great. We have lots of questions coming in, so I'll state some of them, and some of them are related. But the first one is, I'll quote directly, are there any studies that locate in her published text the material from the note cards to determine how the note cards were adapted for inclusion in the text? Do you know about other work that may have been done with these?
Yeah, I know that the note cards have been organized topically. She's pretty organized in the way that she is thinking about her citations. And so I would say that I have to look, I think, deeper in the text to give a better answer. And if you leave your email, I can point you in that direction if you'd like. But I mean, these note cards were the basis of her research and her thought process for the sea around us. So I think, yes, the answer is yes.
Have you taken any tips from Rachel Carson's process for your own research and work?
Well, I think that I always find interesting looking at like the handwriting of our authors and our artists in the archives. And so I think writing down things on note cards is just a great way to create your own archives. I think about the ways in which I document and archive my own work. But also, I mean, she's quite rigorous with the amount of scholarly text that she's looking at. And I think that something that we don't see in the archives, which I mentioned briefly in her friendship with Bob Hines, is that she was working with other scientists who were in the federal government to work on her texts, and especially for Silent Spring. But that there's also like a network of relations that exist within her archives that you can see her citing people that she might not have known, but also her contemplating on the scientists of her day and their interactions. So I think that's kind of interesting to think about, that you can have your own individual research process, but of course it's in this web of relations and ever evolving web of scientific discovery.
To think about that web, that network, has pointed out that somebody who's really been inspired by the Carson Papers is the extraordinary writer and climate activist Terry Tempest Williams, who also obviously has lots of religion and ecology in what she does and calls us to consider. And so I wonder if you know her work and the influence of Carson and what it means to be part of, to use a biblical term, this great cloud of witnesses of people inspired by Carson over time and in our time.
Yeah, I have called not actual like literary pieces or text from the Terry Tempest Williams papers, but I was looking last year, I was really interested in natural elements that were encapsulated in the archive, like pressed flowers or shells, which might, I think, challenge our disciplinary boundaries of what we might call archive or what we might call like natural science or whatnot. And so I was looking at like shells and feathers that Terry Tempest Williams had collected, and thinking about the things that locate us in our places, and the things that locate us in our homes, and the places that we live if we are not yet calling them home. And I think thinking about her lineage through Rachel Carson, who writes about like a vast expanse of geographic places and the ocean, and thinking about our local loves and our local things that we collect, I think is kind of a cool connection between them, but also that Rachel Carson, the lineage of her scholarship and her work is still evolving, and we can see that in younger climate activists, and also I think in my own work I can see that. So it's cool to think about the ways in which we locate ourselves in relation to these scholars.
Right. There's a question I'll quote directly. The audience member asked, quote, does Carson address climate grief in her note cards or elsewhere in her archive? And given the years that have passed since she wrote warning of these changes, how do you deal with climate grief as you engage with these materials?
Yeah, I think that perhaps not explicitly, but when she's thinking about the destruction of species and of history and of people, and she thinks about this through a really interesting nexus of both historical scholarship. She's thinking about how we trace and how we create history, but also through science. I think there's a lot of grief when thinking about the destruction of our habitat. And in her note cards on specifically, interestingly, on historical processes, and like the note cards that I had pulled from where she's citing America is not discovered by Columbus and the destruction of all of these species happened because of colonization. I think she's thinking about grief in those note cards specifically. And also think when she is thinking about individual species as well and extinction. And I think the way that I deal with climate grief is relying on my friends who are poets and thinking about, I find that Rachel Carson's way of writing imagistically and majestically about the environment does not actually like detract anything from it. And I think that her way of romantically thinking about the environment is not really a romantic in an idealized way, but in quite a real way that balances the wonders of our environment with our grief and destruction of it. And so I think that relying on poetry and art to handle grief is really important. But also thinking about, like in my studies at the Divinity School, really changing having paradigm shifts in the way that we think about non-human animals and about humans, and through religion and through practice and through politics, trying to give agency to our natural environment in particular ways. And thinking about that on a national and global scale, I think is quite helpful for thinking about climate grief, that we can recognize the sentience of animals, or that we can recognize the agency of our mountains and our landscape in particular ways. And hopefully that gives you an answer, but I'm always open to other ways to deal with climate grief, as I think it's quite important.
That response connects well to another question, which begins with, quote, thank you for this fascinating talk, Claire, exclamation point, one of many kudos in the chat and the Q&A. The question from the audience member is, and again, I'm quoting, could you talk about whether Carson connected spirituality and religion to her work on climate change, or how you applied religion to studying her work?
Yeah, I'm not sure if she connected spirituality and religion in her work. So Mike, if you know, please let me know. But I think that the ways in which I'm thinking about religion to studying her work is maybe more in one, I'm thinking about like the rituals of the archive and thinking about how we can study her work in almost like a religious way that can be productive. And second, I'm thinking about how religious leaders and how religious or spiritual ways of understanding our being within the environment can expand upon her work and be complementary to her work. Because I think that, especially thinking about, I think the flourishing and emergence of religious commentary on the environment, it is not opposed to her scientific and historical her work. And so I think there is a lot to be explored there and said there. I'm just not sure if she specifically connected spirituality and religion to her work, but I think that now in our current time that it's quite important, and that I think her work is complementary to thinking about religion and climate.
I posted in the chat the link to a description of the papers and a link to the finding aid. There are about 120 boxes in the Rachel Carson papers here at the Beinecke Library, an audience member asked. And that's a beginning place for those interested in learning more. There's a number of things digitized, but obviously there's much more than what's digitized. And that leads me to a question from an audience member about you and your work with these, and again, quoting directly, quote, how does your engagement with the material evidence, i.e. the tangible, these three-dimensional materials, impact your own research? What is lost, if anything, in our digital tools?
Yeah, I think that I find that there's a beauty to both working with physical archives and thinking about digital access. But I do find that, especially when requesting the note cards from Rachel Carson's work, that you have sometimes in your mind when you see things online, like, oh, like, what is the scale of this? Or what does her handwriting actually look like? Or what do these note cards feel like? And I think when you actually get them, you're like, oh, they're much smaller. The box is much smaller than I would think. And sometimes like the paper that she used was recycled. So sometimes the paper was thicker, and on other note cards, she wrote on quite thin, quite thin paper. And so sometimes it was difficult to place them back in the order that she had them because they were so tightly packed in this box. And so, I mean, those types of quite physical elements of the archives you don't have in the digital space. But I also think I think the Beinecke's collection is great, and that working on digitization is also amazing. In case people can't travel to the Beinecke or for whatever reasons. And I think sometimes when you have something digitized, like very up close to it, you can also see things in it that you wouldn't have noticed in person, maybe because it's so small, or there's a particular stain on it, or it's grainy, that I think digital resolution can also lend itself well to that. But I think I loved looking at Rachel Carson's note cards in person because I loved seeing her handwriting, and I loved seeing where the pages were crinkled, or where throughout time perhaps the archive had like written things on it or whatnot. And I think it's really interesting seeing her own handwriting and her own process in the note cards.
I don't know if it's subconscious because of Rachel Carson and others, but I've gone back myself, and in fact, I'm writing questions to you on note cards. It's one of the great durable technologies of humanity. So I highly encourage people to go back or start anew on note cards if you haven't already. And a questioner, audience member said, wouldn't it be great to have this narrative and note cards process worked into a primary school curriculum? So inspiring. So it's more a comment than a question, but I think it's right. One of the things about this form is it's extraordinarily accessible. I am not a PhD scientist and might not read really in-depth scientific articles. But as an entry point, these are really great, including for school-age kids, I would think. So, I mean, I think that's a good point from the audience member. Again, many different kinds of kudos to you. Question from someone coming off of your comment about art and climate grief. Would you kindly share the names of the poets you have found most related to your work in the interpretation of Rachel Carson's thinking and climate change and ecology?
Yes, I was just going to go through. The one person that I'm thinking of is actually my close friend, whose name is Liz Burkemper, who writes poetry on thinking about non-human animals as bodhisattvas and sentient beings. And she writes specifically about cows. So I'm thinking of my friends when I am saying that, but also I was talking to Mike earlier about a course that I took at the Divinity School called Spiritual Topographies, where we discussed a variety of American poets. And there's a specific piece that I think is quite interesting when thinking about grief and war and religion and place, called Salient. It's a reference to both salience as something that's quite relevant or important, and also war salience. And I'm just looking up the author for that. Elizabeth T. Gray, I think, is great. And also I find that just following, not even poetry, but even following climate activists on Twitter and Instagram it's quite inspiring in terms of their rhetoric, even if it's not poetry. But hopefully that answered your question.
Audience member asked if you might put the first writer's name in the chat.
Yeah, I can do that.
A number of people have noted DDT and how Silent Spring led to action. I enjoy it, as do many. In the nature preserve behind where I live, there's osprey and others, and all kinds of life that wouldn't exist but for the banning of DDT that came out of Carson's work. And that leads me, and I think that's a note of hope amidst the grief and the challenges we face, that Rachel Carson not only wrote, but she had tangible impact on policy in making this earth more habitable. And there's a question from an audience member that sort of gets to that, and again, quoting directly, how can Carson's archive propel not just our understanding of climate change, but how can it help stop it?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that the sea around us propelled Rachel Carson in, I think, the American consciousness to a household name. And Silent Spring, which was published much later, I think deals with and it has a direct link to policy change. And I think we can interpret much of Rachel Carson's research in a long history of climate research, and think about acting now instead of just waiting. And I think that at COP26, we've seen a little bit of resistance to this long history of notable anthropogenic climate emissions and of climate change generally. And so I think that Carson, in some ways, for her earlier work, when we're seeing her develop a quite strong environmental ethic, is still working on understanding the environment. And sometimes we need to take the time to understand things that we might not have language for in the environment, to act. And so I think that her note cards are testament to her deep research. But that shouldn't stop us from, curbing our fossil fuel intake, and from not, I think, exploring other forms of justice, like compensatory justice and whatnot. And I don't know. I think that it seems that I think that Rachel Carson's legacy is also something that we can look at to understand how her work can be translated into climate action. And the cool thing, I think, about her legacy is that it's still being created, and that we can dive into her archives to understand her process, but know that she was working for the federal government, and she was working as a scientist and an editor, and working on pieces, not only for the federal government, but a lot of those, her bosses would tell her, oh, you need to publish this, and she would go and publish it. So I find her work quite inspiring for acting now. And I think a lot of her, at least scientific citations, are documenting because they're so early, they're documenting Arctic changes or changes in climate that affect like sea and bird life and industry from that. But I think, we can see the trajectory of her work into a very strong environmental ethic in Silent Spring.
Question about religion and theology, and again, quoting, on the issue of religion, do you see Carson as part of the American American transcendentalist tradition and or other strands of pantheistic thought outside of formal religion?
That's a good question. I think that her writing, I think, is quite reminiscent of early transcendentalists, but that on the topic of climate action and a policy change, that she takes it further and is not completely seeped in romantic vision that has no end. And I think that's where we can see her continued legacy and her importance. And can you remind me of the second half of that question?
In addition to transcendentalism, relation to other strands of pantheistic thought outside of formal religion.
Yeah, I think that I think for the second half, I'm not sure, actually. So I think that her work is keen to notice when humans both power humans' power to be both destructive and to be generative in the environment. And so thinking about, but I do find that her work is making aware, like the quote from Maria Popova, of the one, sorry, my dog is barking in the back, but of dethroning human ego, humans from the center of our environmental thought. And I find that might be complementary to thinking about the non-human outside of religion, but also within religious systems and within spiritual systems, however we want to make those boundaries.
Audience member asked if you detected humor in any of the note cards as you went through them.
I think some of the parts that I really loved from her note cards was seeing when she was like, oh, like, wow, like, or she would write or underline like things in squiggly, like she would underline, I think in the note card of waves as a living thing, she underlined in the squiggly note. And so I think some of her reactions to what she's reading, like her epiphanies, are sometimes funny because you're like, oh, wow, she just had this great epiphany in her note cards. But some of them are, so I think they range in the way, in her voice in them. Sometimes they're just citations, which if you read them can just as a base citation can be quite dry, but that they're actually revealing a larger emphasis on climate change or whatnot. And then there are some where her handwritten notes, I think specifically, are where we can see more of her personality and more of the areas that she's awed by, or that she, I think a lot of it was awe and wonder. And I think that translated into her text. So
the question about what we lose in digital sort of notations and annotations, obviously, as you were talking, I was thinking about William Pickens and his notes, and we had a talk on that. And so the sort of wow exclamation point, but the sense of personality you can get. I wonder if you could unpack a little bit more about Carson's personality as you've come to understand it more in working through the archives. How has Rachel Carson become more of a real personality to you through this process, and how would you describe the personality as you've come to encounter it in the archive?
Yeah, I think when I was reading about Carson originally, and I was thinking about her text on Silent Spring, I was quite aware that she passed just a few years after it was published, and thinking about Rachel Carson as a young scientist who's boarding research vessels, who's wandered by the ocean, I think is quite inspiring to think about our own epiphanies and our own relations to our environment. And I think in looking at her archives, we can see there are photographs of her. I was wondering if I should put them in the presentation, of her as a young child, and then we see her developing her relationships with different scientists and illustrators like Bob Hines. And we see her we can see, I think, in these note cards, her research process in a very specific time period. But the essay that she had written that I pulled from, I think really is where I saw a lot of her personality come through, where she was noting that there were vast expanses of the ocean floor that made her feel inspired but also somewhat insignificant. I feel like in some ways she was saying that there was this whole expanse of a non-human world that is yet to be conceived of, thought about, yet to be described in human language. And I find that quite interesting, thinking about her personality. Also thinking about I think I find this in many other archives as well, but sometimes there are, like stains on some of the note cards, or the note cards are bent in a particular way, and thinking about, was she drinking a cup of tea or a cup of coffee while she was writing her note cards, or is her handwriting a little more messy in this section? Maybe she was tired, and not only thinking about her as a young child, then as a burgeoning researcher, and then as an older woman who died soon after her publication of Silent Spring, but thinking about the little moments in her life that might have contributed to the way that she was writing her note cards.
I put in the chat the link for next week, Mondays at Beinecke, which in some ways is on the theme of now for something completely different. Our colleague Melissa Barton will be talking about Gwendolyn Bennett's letters to Paris, from Paris, which are on display in the show Roadshow. And there is a connection because Claire has been a student curator working on Roadshow. I encourage everybody. And then the following Monday on the 13th, we'll be joined by Grant Hurried, who will be talking about the musical work of Yale Collegium, and we will have a new virtual concert to come for the holidays from Yale Collegium. And on December 20th, we haven't posted the registration link yet, but we will renew a tradition begun last year of doing a Langston Hughes holiday, Mondays at Beinecke. So look forward to those. We have more kudos than we have time to quote, but there are many, and thank you to all the people who've had such nice things to say about the work Claire has done and what she's presented, some follow-up things. I'm particularly struck by the number of people who've commented about the value of these cards and the research that you're pointing to for K-12 students. And I think that's something for us to be thinking about and to follow up on. So appreciate everybody's comments, including those from our colleagues who are educators working in STEM and STEAM in K-12 education. I wanted to give you, Claire, the last words, and you can say whatever you want, but you can give us a benediction. But I wanted to sort of, the prompt being, you are really a fantastic archives colleague. You are not really an intern. You're truly a colleague with Nancy and the work that she's done in Roadshow with Tobias and me and others working in social media. You've been engaged in classwork that uses the archives. So you really are a consummate archives user, and it's really terrific. They are of no value unless people use them. So you have made the archives more valuable by your use. You obviously didn't always work in archives. There was some time in your life where you sort of said, aha, and got into it. And to those who are not as into archives yet as you are, I wonder if you could just, what it's meant for you, and if you have any practical tips on getting involved, whether it's here at the Beinecke or other special collections in the Yale Library, at other places, if you're around New Haven, Southern New Haven Museum, or wherever people may be. Obviously, we have a very distributed audience, but there's archives everywhere. So I wonder if you could just reflect on what archives have meant to you, and what you might do by way of invitation for those who are not yet archives nuts like we are.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for your comments. I'm trying to read all of them, but I can't read them all. So I put my email in the chat if you want to email me, and maybe we can have a further conversation. But I was first inspired to delve into archives in my undergrad in a class on Atlanta's history and its music scene. And then from there, I realized the wealth of experience for authors and also for researchers that archives can give us. And I kind of fell in love with archives here, I'll say, because I was mainly working with digital archives when I was an undergrad in Atlanta. And I think that there's something to me that's interesting and sacred and religious and spiritual about working with archives. And maybe that's just from my perspective, but I find that, especially in thinking even about our environment and about religion, that breaking down our binaries of secular and sacred are really important. And I think that the archive can do that. And I also find that there are moments of joy in the archive that sometimes are not recorded, which is funny, thinking about how archives are places of knowledge and of knowledge production, of education and preservation. But I think that sometimes the unrecorded experiences that researchers have, or that even visitors have to the space of the Beinecke, and the joys that people bring to archives is just amazing. And I love working with archives because, I mean, as I've noted with Carson's archives, you can understand her personality, her way of researching herself a little more than just thinking about, oh, she published these 3 books and then this 4th book. And really, I think also when I had read some pieces by Samuel Delaney, whose archives are at the Beinecke, and looking at some of his illustrations in his archives was really inspiring too, and getting to know our authors more. And yeah, I think that I find that archival institutions should not, I mean, I think that the Beinecke does a really great job of this, that they're not just spaces that exist in a vacuum, but that they of course should be engaging with artists from around the globe. They should be engaging with the public library systems, which I know that we do a lot of work with the New Haven public libraries. And I think that that's the beauty of the Beinecke. And I wish that more people would be able to enter the Marble Kingdom, and that they are not as afraid to go and explore things that are even outside of their discipline. I had a friend say to me, oh, I can just request anything. Yes, you can request, unless if it's, if it's non-circulating, but you can request things in the Beinecke just for fun too, I think. And that's the joy of archival research. And I think I'll end there, but thank you for everyone for coming and for listening to my presentation, and for hopefully seeing Carson in a new light. And I look forward to any of the emails that you send me and for further conversations.
Thank you. And I think that was a wonderful benediction, serving as an invocation, an invitation to the archives. And while due to public health restrictions in the pandemic, we are not as open in this very immediate moment as we typically are, we will be open again in real life in 3 dimensions. We're open always digitally, but this is a place that is an inspiration to all who enter and open to all. In the very current moment, restricted, but that will not last forever and hopefully not for long. So in 2022, we'll be hopefully able to welcome all back as has been the norm and will again be the norm. I invoked a line of scripture, and I think it's a right one to close on again, thinking about Rachel Carson and those who came before, thinking about inspirations amongst us now, like Francis Beinecke, and thinking about great scholars of today and for tomorrow, like you, Claire. It is hopeful to have this pause and for you to talk about archival time and the pause that can help us regenerate and renew. And so thinking of Rachel Carson, thinking of Francis Beinecke, thinking about you, thinking about all of the audience and their great comments. Behold, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. Thank you for great work and for the hope that it gives us for the world we live in and for its future. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great afternoon.